Good morning. My name is Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming at probably the most short notice event we've ever held. And I just want, we like living dangerously here. We love spontaneity. I just want to pay tribute to our brilliant events team for throwing this together at such short notice. Please join me in thanking them for this, because it's a pleasure to do it for Matt Hancock, who's been such a good friend to us through the years. His picture, I think there's several of them, even maybe up on our Rogues Gallery there. So we're looking forward to hearing now. We're probably going to have to replace the picture now after today's event. He's going to be talking about foreign policy, usual house rules here at Policy Exchange. No question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first up. So Matt, thank you for coming here to do this. And in a week when the NHS almost uniquely has become a foreign policy issue, it's deliciously appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you to Policy Exchange for, again, being the fulcrum of ideas in Westminster. And it's an appropriate time because, of course, 75 years ago this week, Allied commanders launched Operation Overlord, unleashing by air and land and sea the forces of over 12 Allied nations, united in purpose in the defeat of Nazi Germany and the liberation of Europe. And D-Day is woven into the personal history of millions of families. It's an enduring source of national pride and a symbol of sacrifices made with our allies. From the men of Sword Beach and Gold to the boys of Pont de Hoc, I think the words of that great president, Ronald Reagan, at the 40th anniversary sum it up. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war. The debt we owe to my grandparents' generation becomes more awe-inspiring with the passage of time. They secured our democracy against fascism. They created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that's kept the peace in Europe. They built the United Nations to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Above all, they gave us that sense of confidence through their example that when our backs are up against the wall as a country, we have the resilience and the grit we need to prevail. Strengthened by their courage, heartened by their valor, and borne by their memory, let us continue to stand for the ideals for which they lived and died. Our predecessors in World War II knew that they and their allies were fighting for democracy and freedom. It was an existential struggle. Today, we're confronted by no such singular threat. We face the complex and shifting landscape of an increasingly multipolar world, with the pressures and strains introduced by globalization, rapid technological change, mass migration, and climate change. But still, our starting point is the same. We have to ask and answer certain fundamental questions. What kind of country do we want to be? What matters most for our citizens? What would we be prepared to die for? What must we protect, defend, and build on in our next generation? And how do we best achieve this? This is not an easy course of action. National security considerations, economic links, the position of our allies, all these must be taken into account. But without values, foreign policy is a mere calculus of interests. It has no anchor. I want to see a Britain that is the best place to live in the world. At our best, we're open and tolerant and diverse and outward-looking as a society, where our young people can benefit from the great opportunities of the 21st century while being insulated from its worst risks and dangers. I want our citizens to be safe from threats at home and abroad, and our nation to be respected internationally as a country that speaks up with confidence for what's right and can back those words with action. I want a Britain in which we, the citizens, are optimistic about our place in the world and confident and fearless in our dealings with other countries. And so I believe we need a foreign policy that creates the conditions for trade and economic growth, that resists protectionism, that diffuses threats before they become dangers on our streets, that upholds our values and that secures and contributes to a secure global environment. In short, we need a foreign policy that is a source of security and opportunity and pride for our whole country. There's no doubt that over the last 3 years, foreign policy has been overshadowed by the difficulties of implementing the EU referendum result. The most urgent task for the next Prime Minister is to resolve this deadlock so we can honour the outcome of the vote in a way that brings people together. As Prime Minister, I would seek to do this on the basis of an agreement with the European Union, not only because of parliamentary arithmetic, but because I believe profoundly that that is what is in the best interests of our country and the interests of all our citizens. A credible plan to deliver Brexit must be grounded in reality, and the reality is there are hard truths. The first hard truth: no deal is not a credible policy choice available to the next Prime Minister. As the Speaker has made clear, Parliament will block it, as it did in March. That means the alternative is either a deal to leave the EU or a general election, second referendum, and potentially no Brexit at all. Second hard truth: renegotiating the political declaration on the future long-term relationship will be easier than reopening the withdrawal agreement, and more important too. We must cast this whole debate forwards from the vehicle of exit to the ambitious future that we want to see. Third, we need to level with people about the trade-off between sovereignty and market access. Given these realities, my Brexit delivery plan is the only credible way to leave the EU by the 31st of October. If I win the contest, I'll treat my election as a mandate for the Conservative Party to vote for a deal to leave the EU. I'll then immediately enshrine EU citizens' rights in UK law. Our European residents have faced uncertainty for far too long. As the basis of our future relationship, I'll propose a comprehensive free trade agreement. In addition, I strongly believe that we should secure a deep security partnership with the EU, and I'll make this a central pillar of our long-term future alliance. Crucially, we need to answer the Irish border question to make Brexit work for the long term. To establish the administrative, the political, the technological solutions to the challenge of how to make an independent UK trade policy compatible with avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland. I'll set up an Irish Border Council. The council will involve the UK, the EU, the Irish government, and all the parties in Northern Ireland. We must win the consent of the north-south border communities to make Brexit work. And finally, as part of this package, we'll seek a time limit to the backstop to ensure that there is an endpoint to the whole process. This plan is deliverable. My conversations with EU colleagues before and since publication give me confidence it can be negotiated, and I believe it will command a majority in the House of Commons so we can leave the EU by the 31st of October. My approach to Brexit is principled, based on values that we hold dear: peace, security, prosperity, clear about what we want to achieve, and based in reality. But there is so much more to UK foreign policy than Brexit. And for wider long-term foreign policy, my approach is the same. I reject any choice between pragmatism and values. We do good in the world when we understand it and hold in our minds both the world as it is and as we want it to be. Deal only with the world as it is, and we fail to achieve clear goals or uphold our values. Deal with the world only as we'd like it to be, and we may bask in the warm glow of appearing to stay true to our values, but in truth, we betray them by opting for magical thinking over the hard choices and trade-offs that reality requires. The West's foreign policy of recent years has all too many examples of magical thinking. In Syria, for example, where we wanted the forces of democratic opposition to succeed, we failed to follow through with the promised support. and were repeatedly disappointed when they didn't live up to our hopes. The West's retreat over Syria has contributed to an advance by our adversaries that they have sought for decades. Or Libya, where we did a better job of getting rid of an evil dictator, we didn't face the realities of the commitment needed to replace him with a stable democratic regime that we had hoped would follow. So we need to be clear as we face each foreign policy dilemma and ask ourselves honestly and truthfully, what are we trying to achieve? Is it the job of a year or 20 years? Do we have the means, the allies, the international coalition, the legal basis, the influence to succeed? Do we know not just how we're going to start, but how we're going to finish? Can we explain what we're trying to do convincingly, both to Parliament and the public? I want to see Britain engaged in the world, forceful in defence of our British interests, ambitious in promoting our democratic values, on the basis of the best foreign policy analysis grounded in reality and backed up by the commitment and resources to see the job through. Think of the assets we already have as a nation, the fundamental strength of our economy, the 5th largest in the world, the protection and assurance provided by our armed forces, diplomats and intelligence agencies who are second to none and who we again pay tribute to today. The security we derive from our membership of the world's most powerful military alliance, NATO, and our Five Eyes intelligence partnership with our closest allies. Our influence as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Our development program, one of the largest any country has in the world, bar the United States, and the attractive power of language, law, culture, and history. So we have every reason for confidence and optimism about our country's place in the world, and a government I lead would pursue a foreign policy guided by these 5 core principles. First, we need a foreign policy that benefits all of our country, supporting jobs and investment and security in all parts of the United Kingdom. We have a responsibility to preserve and defend our union, through which, together, this country is greater than the sum of its parts. Building a new consensus about Britain's place in the world should be a major focus of the next British government, starting with Brexit, but going far beyond it. In particular, as we leave the EU, our role within NATO becomes more important. So second, the government I lead would work to strengthen the North Atlantic Treaty, the North Atlantic Alliance, the transatlantic relationship, and our ability to think and act together on the major strategic questions of the 21st century. NATO is an essential part of our response to the challenges posed by threats in cyberspace, in international terrorism, and insecurity in Europe's near neighbourhood and, of course, beyond. None of our adversaries or competitors can draw on the kind of values-based alliance that we have in NATO, and nothing would hearten them more to see any weakening of the security of Europe or the transatlantic alliance. Britain can exert influence in Europe and in America, and when Britain is strong, both sides of the Atlantic look to us to build the common ground. A crucial opportunity to do that will come in this December, when the UK will host the next NATO summit. As Prime Minister, I would focus on bringing together the United States and Europe to reinforce our alliance. And a government I lead would have no hesitation in expressing a distinctive viewpoint and working with the US and our European allies to find agreement and grounds for a common approach to urgent issues. But we must remember that as allies, we share far more in common than anything that may at times appear to divide us. My third principle is that Britain should lead the West's response to China's strategy to win the 4th industrial revolution. The second half of the 20th century was dominated by an arms race. The first half of the 21st century is already being dominated by the technology race. China has a clear and determined strategy. The West does not, and we need one fast. The most effective response to long-term planning by our competitors or adversaries is to forge a long-term strategy of our own. When it comes to technology, communications is the defence industry. In traditional defence industries, British companies, are global leaders. We need a communications British champion, and the government should create the market conditions for one to develop. Now, this insight, perhaps high-sounding, has very practical consequences. We need our communication systems to be secure, and we've worked with Huawei to ensure that the current 4G technology, in that technology they are. Yet questions are being raised about Chinese equipment on the next generation of technology. Simplistic answers abound that underplay or ignore the full extent Huawei are already embedded within current technology. But we know that Huawei in technology is not the best, and we would like more assurances over our systems. But we can't just ban without a replacement, and we shouldn't shirk from having that replacement, preferably British. The question of whether we should have Chinese equipment on our 5G networks is asking the question the wrong way round. The question should be, why don't we have a homegrown solution? Put it another way, we should beat Huawei with a British champion of our own, a champion that can become a global leader. As Digital Secretary, I oversaw the decision to keep the Chinese state-owned communications provider ZTE off our systems. And I know this, a British communications infrastructure champion would increase our economic potential, give important security assurances, and increase our soft power. The same is true, by the way, of our response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. We shouldn't complain about it, we should match it from the West with our own global strategic investment strategy. Let us finance the roads and the ports and the networks of the rapidly developing world. This focus on communications also leads directly to cyber defense. It's not just that our adversaries are attacking us in cyberspace. Here, we must be ready. And we're better placed than most nations thanks to our National Cybersecurity Centre, which I set up as the Minister for the Cabinet Office. Those with a different view of the world are doing their best to bend the very rules of the internet towards state control and censorship. The Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans are constantly looking for vulnerabilities in our networks, whether to spy on us or steal our IP or position themselves so they can mount a cyber attack on us in the future. The Chinese and Russians are building international support for a different vision of the internet, not global and not free. They want an internet in which states are sovereign. We've seen the implications for freedom just this week, with a crackdown on messages around the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And if we're not careful, we'll wake up in a few years' time and find they've succeeded by winning the debates in international organizations like the UN and the WTO, setting the technical standards and building an international coalition behind them. I believe we should defend freedom online just as robustly as we stand up for it in the real world. We must make sure that the freedom that is such an essential part of the internet and an essential value of ours is preserved. Now, this doesn't mean unfettered freedom. Just as Britain having free speech doesn't mean you can incite violence or stir up racial hatred. Democracies like ours need to have the confidence to set the norms and the rules for freedom online, just as we have offline. We need the confidence as a free society to move the basis of the internet from libertarian to liberal. Britain can lead this globally, and as Prime Minister, I would make sure that we do. This leads me to my fourth principle. A government I lead would invest in Britain's diplomatic influence and capability. Our country's ironclad commitment to spending 2% of GDP on defence is an essential part of our commitment to NATO, and as our economy grows, we should have an ambition to increase it. I also support and will uphold the long-standing principle of spending 0.7% of GDP on international development. But entirely missing from this equation has been the question of the resources needed to give maximum strength to the diplomacy and trade policy of the UK. Foreign policy exists to address conflict and insecurity at its root, to reduce the need either for military intervention or open-ended humanitarian assistance. The value of our embassies and residences and high commissions overseas cannot be measured on a Treasury spreadsheet. The same's true of the resources of our soft power, our culture, our heritage, and indeed the BBC, with its unparalleled ability to project British values and objective fact worldwide. All these must be woven in and are inextricably linked to our values-based yet hard-headed assessment of foreign policy. So we need the strongest possible diplomatic firepower alongside our military and intelligence capabilities, and a government I lead would urgently assess this as a matter of national urgency. Some have suggested that a new target, that security and defence spending together should reach 3% of GDP, and we should examine this idea seriously. Because the future lies not in siloed services, but in a full spectrum, first tier, day one capability, special forces, cyber, intelligence, working alongside the potential to project conventional hard power, combined with softer persuasive power, harnessed all by a foreign policy steeped in the statecraft of diplomacy. This investment in diplomacy includes strengthening our ties with long-standing partners such as Japan and continuing to build stronger our links with the emerging democratic powers of the 21st century like India. After all, over the coming decade, we will see an even greater contest of ideas between the Western liberal democratic model and the authoritarian model of governance represented by the rise of China. An estimated 2/3 of people living under democratic systems today are in non-Western and developing countries. This is important. Deepening our existing political and economic links with our fellow democracies outside NATO is a great strategic prize for which we should be aiming. Liberal democracy is a precious thing. Those of us who are lucky to live in freedom should come together to defend freedom. We have to retain faith in our democracy and rules of law and not allow either to be eroded from within by the forces of narrow nationalism. And of course, while we need to do all that we can to promote liberal democracy, we need to know that progress can often take time and the calls for strategic patience to see our commitments through, from the Western Balkans to Afghanistan. Requiring results in time for the news cycle or even the parliamentary cycle can often guarantee that the enterprise fails. And developing sustainable democracy is never just about making sure there's an election. Security, peace, and overcoming the legacy of conflict is the work of decades, and we need to show this sustained commitment. Let's think of an example that is apposite today. Had we simply walked away from Germany in the 1950s, only a few years after the end of the war, it would not be the prosperous, stable democracy it is today. And the fifth principle that would guide my foreign policy is that we must reject the false choice between our interests and our values on the one hand, and we must maintain human rights and the protection of liberal democracy as an essential DNA of our foreign policy. The starting point, of course, is always our national interests, but our interests should not come at the expense of our values, whether in trade or countering terrorism or addressing illegal migration or building alliances to tackle global warming. If, in order to deliver Brexit, we were to change who we are as a country, we would have failed. Although we're leaving one union, we must double down on our membership of and commitment to other rules-based global institutions. It's in our interests to uphold a rules-based global order in trade and warfare as much as in human rights. And as Prime Minister, whether it's at the UN or at WTO, I would look to strengthen the fabric of institutions that make up this order. A government I lead would also take a hard look at all our bilateral relationships to make sure that the balance is right on crucial decisions affecting human rights. And at a time when we see concerted efforts to roll back gains made in women's rights and LGBTQ rights internationally, any British government must rally like-minded nations to protect and preserve the advances that have been made and go further. And as Health Secretary, I've seen the critical importance of universal access to healthcare as part of the advancement of women's rights, and this would be something I would continue to determinedly champion as Prime Minister. We all know that younger people in our country see climate change and the protection of our environment as central to the global challenge too, and they expect world leaders to solve it. They believe, and I believe, that we must build a world for future generations, not just short-term needs. So that means concerted action to reduce carbon emissions, bringing the United States back into the Paris Agreement, getting China and India to reduce not just air pollution, but their greenhouse gases too. Promoting our trade should sit alongside urging all countries to do more to rid our air of pollution and our oceans of plastics. Foreign policy is not a hobby for diplomats or a pastime for prime ministers. It's the strategy we pursue to achieve the very best for each of our citizens and for our country as a whole. We need a foreign policy that focuses on security and opportunity for the whole United Kingdom, and of which our whole country can be proud. A foreign policy that delivers Brexit, but is not consumed by it. That secures new trade and jobs opportunities for Britain, but not at the expense of human rights and democracy and the values that matter to people. That deepens the transatlantic alliance, but also builds the new deep partnerships we need for our economy and our security. We should be the country that doesn't question whether we punch above our weight, but simply pulls our weight, as we always have done, on international peace and security and the good of our own people. Speaking before the Second World War and anticipating the inferno to come, Winston Churchill said of our country that in all the great struggles in which we've been engaged, we have survived and emerged victorious not only because of the prowess of great commanders or because of famous battles gained by land and sea, but also because the true interests of Britain have coincided with those of so many other states and nations, and that we have been able to march in great company along the high road of progress and freedom for all. 75 years since D-Day, we can see how far our country has come along that high road. Let us have confidence in our values, in support of our interests, and travel that high road once more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. As indicated, he's very kindly agreed to answer questions. Just want to get a sense of how many people want to ask. And gentleman in the front. Yeah, name and organisation, please.
Good morning, James Landale. Thank you for that, Matt. Two questions. One is, there's a view within many people in foreign policy circles that before the UK can establish a more effective foreign policy in the future, there has to be a reckoning about its own place in the world, that it has to no longer have a misguided sense of itself, that there's too much of a sort of post-war hangover, that it exaggerates the role that Britain plays, and that therefore before any really effective foreign policy can take place, the UK and whoever leads it has to be honest and level with itself and with its people before it says this is what we can do in the world. What do you think of that? I mean, obviously that's a very sensitive question on today of all days. Second question was, you talk about pragmatism, but your solution to the Huawei conundrum seems to be the creation of an alternative British, European telecoms giant, which may be laudable, but it's certainly not imminent. And it's certainly not a solution to a policy choice that has to be made within a matter of months. So I wonder if you could be more specific about that.
It is absolutely the case that the debate about Britain's place in the world needs to precede the policy consequences of that debate. And I think that Brexit is an opportunity to reassess and to decide as a country how we want to be seen in the world, and indeed what sort of country we want to be domestically, and to ask those questions. I regret that in the 3 years since Brexit, we haven't done as much as we could have done to ask those questions. And I've seen this debate in which you put what I would call the pessimist's case, where some say we need to assess downwards our potential impact in the world. I think that our place in the world needs to be defined post-Brexit and needs to be defined as one of the most open, international, outward-looking, gregarious and engaged nations in the world that is honest yet ambitious about our place. And we can only do that if we ground our policy in values. The hard power projection and the economic impact of good trade relationships are, of course, important. And we need to recognize that they play a part, but we also need to recognize our scale. But on the projection of values, we can build alliances like no other country can. And we have capabilities through our language and our law and our alliances and our culture and the ability to engage, combined with those hard resources that mean that we have a vital role to play. So I think we need to be honest yet ambitious in terms of our place in the world, and I reject the pure pessimism of some in that debate. But the honesty is important as well as the ambition. When it comes to Huawei, as I said in the speech, some of the simplistic answers that are being given underplay the extent to which we have been working with Huawei on current technology with assurances by the security agencies and the need to make sure that we have high-quality telecoms infrastructure. I know how much people complain when they can't get their broadband or their phone signal. But the future of this, our position in terms of communications infrastructure, I think has not been properly discussed, because we've assumed that the choices available now are the only choices that will be available in the future, and we can do something about that. And the government can act to make sure we get to a position where we can be reliant on technology that we trust.
I think, get a flavour. Lady there, towards the front. Yes, name and organisation, please.
Hello, my name's Kate Ferguson from The Sun. Matt, obviously you're speaking today when we have our closest ally, Donald Trump, here visiting us. I wondered, do you think it's appropriate of the US president to wade into the Tory leadership contest by giving warm words about some of your rivals? And were you upset at being snubbed for an invite to have talks with the president?
No, I thought that might be on the phone, actually, during the speech, to talk about how the NHS won't be on the table during trade talks. I'm delighted that the President has agreed that the NHS won't be on the table during trade talks. And you know, everybody knows that President Trump makes his views clear. I didn't seek a meeting with President Trump, and I'm not having one. And that's fine by me.
Other question? Gentleman there, on the side. Name and organisation.
Richard Walton, I'm a senior fellow here at Policy Exchange. You appear to be a bit ambiguous on the Huawei issue, and China in particular in a geostrategic context. Would you treat China as a friend, ally, or adversary?
I'm rooted in reality, and foreign policy and decisions like these need to be rooted in reality. That inevitably leads to trade-offs as opposed to simplistic assessments and positioning on one side or the other. If you call that ambiguity, I call it realism. But the overall position towards our relationship with China, I think, is clearly spelled out, which is that we need to remember that for whatever differences we may have with our European partners and with the United States and with other liberal democracies around the world, we share values of democracy and of the fundamental belief in the dignity of each individual. And of course we have differences of tone and of policy, but the fundamental values are very strong. Now, I think that we need to engage very warmly with China. We need to trade well with China, but we also need to remember that our foreign policy should be rooted in the values that we hold dear.
Gentleman there in the middle, in the aisle. Yeah. Name and organisation, please.
John Peet from The Economist. On Brexit, you proposed that you would not reopen the withdrawal agreement, but then you added a bit later that actually you would seek a time limit on the backstop.
Yes.
That would be an enormous change to the withdrawal agreement, which the Irish government and the rest of the EU has already said no to. What would you do if you don't get agreement on a time limit?
Well, I'm confident that this, as a whole package, can be negotiated. We know that the EU was considering proposing a time limit in the previous negotiations. That didn't come about in the end, but I'm confident that, as a package, this can be negotiated. A time limit would be an appendum rather than a reopening of the withdrawal agreement. And as I said in the speech, since I published this plan at the weekend, I have cautious optimism about its ability both to get through the House of Commons and to get through and to be supported by the EU. After all, it's in the interest of all parties that we leave with a deal on the 31st of October.
Just trying to get a flavour of who wants to. Lady at the back. Name and organisation, please.
Thanks. Nicola Bartlett, Daily Mirror. I was wondering if you agreed with your leadership rival, Boris Johnson, that the Conservative Party faces potential extinction if it doesn't deliver Brexit. And do you believe that under the change to the rules of the party leadership contest that you have enough support to succeed?
The answer to the second one is yes. The answer to the first one is that I think this is a very serious point for all major parties, both major parties in British politics. We're at an incredibly important moment in the politics of our nation, because the need for a progressive, optimistic, centrist force in British politics has never been greater. The opportunity for a Conservative Party that dominates the centre ground and that delivers on the things that matter for people, making sure we have increased living standards and people have more money in their account at the end of the month and that public services are properly funded and well run. The opportunity for a party that stands for these things is enormous, because the other major parties have left that ground and are concentrating on the hard left in the case of Labour, and of rejecting the result of the referendum in the case of the Lib Dems. So there's a huge opportunity, and there is a need and a duty on the Conservative Party to get this right, to deliver Brexit, then not be defined by Brexit, and go on and concentrate on all the bread and butter issues that really matter to people.
Matt, can I just ask three subjects of particular interest to Policy Exchange's workstream? First of all, we published a few years ago posthumous writings of Joe Cox, The Cost of Doing Nothing, and at the end it had a chronology of just quite how often British troops had been in action since the 19th century, intervening overseas. Just first of all, your assessment of where the British public is now on intervention overseas. Bear in mind, you've made reference, obviously, to Syria 2013 and Libya 2011. Second, we've done a lot of work on the backstop. Interested in your assessment of where the Northern Ireland Unionist parties are on your proposal, if I can call it, for a Council of Ireland, to use the terminology of another era. Third, we've done a lot of work on lawfare, the impact of lawfare on our troops. You were last here when David Petraeus came to Policy Exchange. He said on our platform that the impact of lawfare on the British forces in his assessment was, if I can summarise, making them a less attractive partner for the United States because of differential legal regimes, successive inquiries, and so on, impacting on the morale and efficiency of our forces. I'd just like you to, if you have a moment, to reflect on that package of issues of significance to us as an organisation.
Yes, I think that the cost of inaction can be very significant in foreign policy. I regret deeply that Parliament voted against action in Syria. And I think that has, I mentioned it in the speech, I think that has led to an advance by our adversaries, and in particular Russia, that they had sought for many, many years. And thanks to the short-term action of some MPs, and I don't want to get into a blame game, but we all know what happened. We undermined the whole of Western foreign policy in a way that was incredibly unfortunate. And in a way, that has demonstrated the costs of inaction in a way that none of us would have wanted to see demonstrated. On the European proposals, of course, I've been talking to the DUP, and I believe that these proposals are deliverable both in Europe and in Parliament, and they present, in my view, the only credible way forward that's been presented so far for how we leave the European Union on the 31st of October with a deal. And as I've said, I think that trying to turn a no deal exit into the policy of the government has great risks in Parliament, and I think it is very strongly in the national interest that we leave on a deal, and I think that this deal has the potential to be delivered.
And on lawfare?
And on lawfare, well, I'm very worried about the impact of some of the legal cases and the historic legal cases on our ability to act in our national interest in the future. Ultimately, we need a system that is based on values, and our values include adherence to the rule of law. But that legal framework needs to reflect the realities of what it is to be in combat. And unless it is, then it is a hindrance on our ability to project and defend British national interests around the world.
Thank you. I see some other questions, some other hands. Gentleman there on the side, yeah. Name and organisation, please.
Russell Langer from the Jewish Leadership Council. I was wondering if you could say how you would approach Donald Trump's so-called deal of the century in terms of the Middle East peace process, and what you see as the British role in that process.
Well, the Middle East peace process has long been a US lead, and I think that the British role in our very strong alliance with the United States is to support that, but making sure where we have clear points of difference. For instance, it is not our policy, and I strongly agree with this, it is not our policy to move the embassy to Jerusalem. Nevertheless, we support the United States in trying to achieve a deal that is acceptable to all sides.
Gentleman there. Listen. Name and organisation, please.
Lucas Very, BP. So how would you like to help British companies like BP to prosper and to make sure we reach carbon neutrality while also providing enough energy?
Well, what a great question. And it's a great question because because this is a foreign policy discussion, and our ability to reach carbon neutrality is a question of foreign policy too. And clearly our ability to support major British companies around the world is a critical part of our foreign policy. So we could talk about the domestic mix. I note that we've just ended the longest run since the 19th century of powering Britain without coal, and that run seems to get longer and longer. But our ability to support our businesses around the world is a vital part of projection of our values. After all, business is a force for good, and business done right can help to build and strengthen alliances, and BP is a good example of how we should support companies to do that.
Any further questions to Essie? Yes, a few. Lady there at the front. Name and organisation, please.
Jenny McKinnon from PA. You talked about universal healthcare and the importance of that with women's rights. I just wondered if you would be taking into account America's apparent rollback on abortion rights when you're looking at any bilateral deals.
Well, I'm a very strong supporter of the laws that we have here in England, and I'm reluctant to go further than that because I'm also very proud that in England this is not a matter of political debate. There is a strong consensus, and we should retain that consensus. It is medically and scientifically, clinically led, and I strongly support women's rights, but I also prefer the question of abortion not to be a political one, and I think that is one of the remaining virtues in British politics. If we think about how British politics has become more and more difficult in terms of the discourse, and how there's the president on the phone again. You better get it. If we think about how the British political discourse has become more rough and more focused at the extremes, and probably exacerbated by social media, one of the areas where we retain a strong consensus that is above politics is in our support for abortion laws as they stand.
Just a couple more questions, I think, and then perhaps we take them as a brace of questions. Gentleman there in the middle, first one. Name and organisation.
Barney Trimble, the Initiative for Free Trade. I was wondering where you stood on possible UK ascension to CPTPP, or the Comprehensive and Progressive Trade-Pacific Partnership, and also the possible creation of a CANZUK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, free trade and free movement area.
Well, I'm a free trader. You cut me down the middle and you get a free trade stick of rock. And I think I'm mixing metaphors, but but I'm a free trader to my core, and so I'm interested in participation in all of these different international agreements. And I think that we should encourage our allies to do the same, because these both a combination of multilateral and bilateral agreements is a valuable way forward. And the role of Britain post-Brexit will be to build alliances around the world with those who we have shared values and interests. And the examples that you state are two of them. And we need to make sure that we have as free-flowing trade with as many countries as we can possibly achieve that with. Thank you very much.
Thank you.